The following is a presentation from TNTP. If your school or district is interested in direct support related to the content of this session, or if you have any questions, please contact us by emailing maya.baker@tntp.org or christopher.henderson@tntp.org. You can find us online at www.tntp.org or on Facebook, Twitter, or LinkedIn. Now, please enjoy the session.
Hi, my name is Caitlin McDermott, and welcome to Session 3 of the Science of Reading training brought to you by the Nebraska Department of Education and TNTP. Today we'll be covering navigating text complexity, and I'm super excited because it's one of my favorite sessions. We are super excited to be working with you. Over the last several weeks, the team that has been working with you consists of Caitlin McDermott, me, Namisha Thakur, and Kenna McWhorter. So our goals for today is to continue to explore what cognitive science tells us about how students learn to read. And specifically today, we want you to walk away understanding why complex text matters in preparing students for college and career. We know that a lot of you are coming to us from the K-3 world, and we want to really hit home the fact that this matters in K-3, even though a lot of this is preparing our kids for college and career. We also want you to walk away understanding the idea that reading is a set of strategies that can be taught in isolation and applied to any text is actually a myth that has been dispelled by reading science research. And we also want you to understand that all students need access to complex text and reading instruction that instead focuses on navigating the specific complexities of the text at hand rather than just those isolated strategies and skills. So the way that we are going to do that today is we are going to explore some key research on the importance of providing all students access to complex text. We're going to explore the shifts that need to be made in instruction and the ways to support struggling students. And finally, we are going to reflect and determine some action steps to apply to our current work. So let's just kind of ground ourselves and kind of take a second to go back to some of our earlier sessions and look at the simple view of reading. So how do we learn to read, and what is reading acquisition? So first, we talked about decoding and all the different skills, the foundational literacy skills that go into just simply learning to decode the text. And then we focused on, we've started to focus on language comprehension skills. And last week we talked about the knowledge building and vocabulary that students need in order to access a lot of these complex texts. And then when they're able to build that knowledge and gain that vocabulary, and then get that repeated practice with complex texts and start to, in that repeated practice, kind of understand the ways that we navigate those complex texts, that kind of helps us equal reading comprehension. when you really break that down, this is Scarborough's rope. So when you go from sort of that simple view of reading to our more complex view of reading, what does that decoding and word recognition really break down into? It's an understanding of words, letters, and sounds, and how they all come together to increase that automaticity of decoding, right? And then language of comprehension, when you are putting together that knowledge building, that vocabulary, understanding the complexity of sentences, starting to make connections and understanding the gist of a text, all of those things kind of coming together, you become increasingly strategic and able to navigate those text complexities. And so as those things start to intertwine, as you get into second and third grade, and you start to become increasingly automatic, increasingly strategic, your understanding, your reading comprehension ability increases. So let's dig into text complexity and why it matters. So take a minute to click on the link to the Padlet in the notes here, and I want you to think about the article that you read as pre-work for this. What is text complexity and why does it matter? So if you're leading this PD, go ahead and press pause while folks put in the results to their Padlet or put in the chat. Great. So some of the things you should have pulled out here are working with complex texts is needed to gain the mature language skills for college and careers. Giving students only a simplified text really robs them of the critically important exposure to academic vocabulary, and it doesn't build perseverance. It doesn't build perseverance with some of those complex texts that they're going to encounter over and over again. There's also no evidence that struggling readers catch up by gradually increasing that length or volume of simpler texts. And the effects are not neutral or even more severe for students who have been disenfranchised from text and reading before starting school. So basically, when you start to increase text gradually, that actually students get further and further behind with something we call the Matthew effect. So let's dig into a couple of research articles that talk to us both about why complex texts are so important and why focusing on text complexity matters more than individual skills. So let's first start out with where kids come in when they're reading their high school texts. So Metametrics did this study, and Metametrics is the organization that developed the Lexile, which is one of the leading indicators for measuring text complexity. And they found that the typical text students read in high school, the orange here, is significantly less complex than the text that they need to read in college and career level. So when you look at this next piece in the SATs and college textbooks, it's much higher. So even just the tests that they need to take to get into college, so the SAT and the ACT, or even the AP exam, which they take in high school, at the end of the courses that they're taking in high school, is already way more complex than the literature and textbooks that they're reading. So you can just see that comparison. That jump is pretty significant that they're going to have to take. And then say kids don't go to college. Say they enter the military, or they go into just entry-level jobs right after high school, or just their personal reading. Well, look at that, way above where they're already going to be, So students must read texts that build their current understanding, challenge their views, and broaden their perspectives. And they're just not doing that. The bottom line is that in order to prepare students for college and careers and to close the text complexity gap, all students need to read a lot of complex texts that broaden their views, perspectives, and knowledge. The problem is that too few students are getting those chances, either because of teacher individual choices or because the way the system is set up. So because of the way that the curriculum is set up at the district level, or even what states require. So this is a really, really fascinating study. We read briefly about this in the Lehman article, but it's really the keystone research on text complexity. So I wanted to take a few minutes to dig into it. What do the assessments show us about instruction? So let's look at this study that was done through ACT, and they actually looked at over several years their own ACT scores and the performance on their own tests. I'm gonna pause for a minute. I just want to point out a few things before I let you kind of marinate on this for a second. This is the ACT reading benchmark. So this line here is kind of the line that signifies a good reader. This 21 here signifies, this line here signifies what we would call, a quote unquote good reader. And then over here, you have the percent correct. So their achievement on the test. So here is what you would call quote unquote a good reader, and then over here their achievement on the reading comprehension portion of the ACT test. So take a minute. I'm going to pause. Just go ahead and pause the recording. Just want to know, turn and talk, type in the chat, however you're doing this PD. What do you notice here? So what you should have noticed is that the higher the student's general reading ability, so again, the higher the student's general reading ability over here, this the x-axis over here, the higher their performance. And what you'll notice here is that they looked at these literal and inferential questions. So meaning some are kind of right there questions, some require sort of inferencing skills, like these are your main idea or drawing conclusion questions, what we would consider more of your critical thinking skills. And what they found was there was no difference, right? There's no difference in that sort of, whether they were inferential or literal questions, that didn't matter. What really mattered was can kids' general reading ability, right? If you are a good reader, you are going to score higher on the test. If you are a poorer reader, then you are going to score lower. The skills, the individual skills, whether it's right there or more inferential, there was no difference at all, really, in the type of questions, which is really, really interesting. Which is really, really interesting here. It really was more about text complexity. Let's break that apart a little bit more. So if you look over here, ACT then looked at breaking down those skills even more. Okay, let's take all of those more detailed skills: main idea and author's approach, supporting details, character relationships, meaning of words, generalizations and conclusions, right? Let's break those down. And again, you don't really see any difference. So, if you think about all those times you've been told that if you want to, raise achievement, you have to go in after a reading comprehension test and do an item analysis, right? And figure out, which standards or which skills did students do poorly on. And then if it's main idea, if the main idea part of the kid's brain isn't working, then we have to go in and we have to give them a bunch of practice with main idea and they'll do better on the test, right? That's what we do. That's what we've been doing for years. But what this data is telling us is that that's a fool's errand. You can't teach them in any meaningful way that they're all clumped together. They're all part of something bigger. So what is that bigger thing that they're all a part of? And if we move to the next slide, we can kind of see that. So this is super interesting, right? So again, we have our line here, and if we look here at this line of our kind of uncomplicated or more challenging, and by more challenging they just mean kind of just more technical texts, right? So if you just look at those kind of follow that same arc that you saw with the other ones, sort of straight across. But if you look at the texts that are more complex, it follows this really interesting line, right? You have your readers here, your proficient readers, your generally good readers right here, that line. And then you have this line which says, oh, you're going to get about a 30%, which interestingly is what you would get almost about if you were going by chance, right? So if you have 4 questions, you're guessing about 25% chance. That's pretty much what you've got here with this line. But then once you get to that 21 mark, that proficient reader mark, then you start to see this line go up and at a much higher level. So the difference doesn't seem to be about skills or strategies or about those individual reading skills. It's about text complexity. So when you are a more proficient reader, generally, you can access more complex text. And that's really the defining characteristic of what is going to make that steeper climb for you. So before we pause and let you kind of let that sink in, I want to be clear that the problem with text complexity doesn't start in high school, right? It really starts in the earliest grades. We talked about the Matthew effect before, but basically it's this idea, from the Bible, a passage in the Bible, from Matthew, this idea of the rich get richer, right? And it's this idea that the more often, right, like if you have your good readers, and we'll talk about that in a minute, your good readers improve at a faster pace than your poor readers. And the reason why is that we are exposing them to more complex texts, so they're getting that more often. They are gaining more knowledge because they're being exposed to higher quality texts more often, and they're getting more in those more complex, higher quality texts. They are also being exposed to more rich vocabulary, and all of this is allowing them to grow at a much faster pace. And so this starts literally in kindergarten, right? The more that we feed them in kindergarten, in first grade, the more that they'll know. Now, I'm not saying you're going to put a complex text in front of a kindergartner and say read, right? But it's the difference between, reading aloud a book like Boom Chicka Boom and pretending like that's a comprehension book. You can read that aloud for, phonological awareness or phonemic awareness kind of skill, that kind of stuff, to build those skills. But you also have to be exposing our kinder and first graders to rich read alouds, where you're exposing them to rich, complex texts and ideas, building their knowledge about the world around them, about different themes. So you can read to them books like Amazing Grace. They can handle those kind of complex texts in kindergarten and first grade. And you're reading aloud to them to build their content knowledge, to build their understanding of complex language, their rich vocabulary, their understanding of, they're deepening their understanding of theme and central idea, and how to find that in a book through their language comprehension, even if it's not their reading comprehension. And you can see that here, in these lower ages, you're doing that through listening comprehension. And right around first, second, third grade is when you're also starting to build their reading comprehension as well. And in your kinder, first, second grade is when you are also building their decoding skills at the same time, so that when it comes to third grade, right around here, right, you are now have this moment when they are putting together all of the pieces, and now they can decode on their own, and you've built up their listening comprehension, so they have those stores of knowledge and vocabulary, so they can take on those complex texts on their own now that they can read and decode on their own. So take a minute to read this quote and this is from David Lieben, who wrote the article that you read for pre-work. Go ahead and take a minute to read this quote from David Lieben, and then type in the chat or turn and talk, however you're showing up for this PD. Go ahead and reflect on the research that we've just read, and take a second to just reflect. What are you thinking? What did you hear that that sort of resonated with you? What did you hear that surprised you? Okay, the last thing that I kind of want to bring up is the idea of leveled reading instruction. There's quite a bit of research that shows that it does not close gaps over time. On the left side, I want to talk about a study from Jean Marshall that is forthcoming. It's not published yet, but Marshall Jean, and he's a research fellow at Northwestern University, and he tracked nearly 12,000 students from kindergarten through third grade in more than 2,000 schools. And they followed them through high, middle, and low reading groups and ungrouped reading classes. And he found that about half of the children who were in the lowest reading group in kindergarten were able to improve at least to at least the middle by the end of first grade. By the end of third grade, 46% of those who had previously been in the lowest group in second grade were able to move up. However, Jean found that none of the students initially placed in the lower group in kindergarten ever caught up to the reading level of their classmates who started out in the highest group. So half of them could move up to the middle, but none of them could ever reach those of the classmates that started out in the highest group. And so that structural inertia is really considerable, right? Whereas the highest reading group in the earlier grade really tended to protect students from being put in the lower groups later, even if they had significantly lower scores. And students in the lowest reading group not only progressed more slowly academically, but while they were in the lower reading groups, they were also slower to develop learning behaviors, such as varied interests, concentration on tasks, and persistence in the face of difficulty. So those behaviors also reduce the likelihood of moving up to the higher reading groups later in later grades. And then this study on the right is interesting. It's based on the NAEP, and it was published in, I think, EdWeek. So you can kind of read about it in there. There's a link in the notes. But it basically showed that high and low poverty classes that used ability-based reading groups almost always scored lower on average than those that hardly ever used them on the NAEP test. So pretty powerful there. I'm going to pause there for a minute because I really do want you to reflect on this, because I know a lot of us use or have used in the past leveled reading groups. So I want to give you a chance to kind of pause and take that in for a minute and just reflect on what this means for you and your instruction. Okay, so taking all of that research together, go ahead and again, with a partner, whole group, or in the chat, however you're participating today, what resonated with you about the research we have gone through? What surprised you, and what wonderings do you still have? Okay, so what instructional shifts do we need to make in order to support our students in navigating complex text? Let's look again at what happens when we keep kids in these instructional levels. This is kind of when we would, put kids in the old bluebirds, cardinals, crows groups. It all good intention, kind of thinking that learning was facilitated by making sure that students were given text that they could read fairly well, kind of that instructional level, just below, just below what they could read perfectly, and just above what they could read at their quote unquote frustration level, right? The problem with this approach is that when we give students texts that are at their current reading level or just below, just above, those students who are at stronger levels keep getting exposed to more complex vocabulary and ideas and improve their comprehension, while the lower readers get less access to those things and fall farther behind. So let's just take a look at the vocabulary grade 4 students are exposed to in a typical leveled reading program. So the first column are the vocabulary words for the lowest level readers in a current basal, and then the middle column for readers on grade level, and the last column for readers above grade level. So, this might be fine one day, but just think about if you multiply this, 5 days a week, 4 weeks a month, 10 months a year, and this is the achievement gap at work, right? Students who start behind fall further behind because we're giving them less instead of what they need to catch up, which is more. And the research shows us that the more words you learn, the Matthew effect again, the more you're going to grow. And so we have to do, something more. So what is that more? Go ahead and pause this and watch the video of Tim Shanahan and see what he thinks about what instructional changes are necessary to improve students' reading comprehension. Great. So Shanahan, in only the way Shanahan can say it, tells us that we really need to add on the pounds, right? We need to add on the pounds, which means add on the text complexity. We need to bump up the level of the text, not necessarily focus on those individual skills and strategies. over here, how do we do that, right? What do we do that's different? So I think in the past, right, we've really focused on looking at the reader's level of comprehension and really matched it to the text level of complexity. And that has always been the remediation that we've gone to. That's how we've intervened. That's how we've scaffolded for kids. But now we've forgotten that we can use the teacher to support instead of being sort of that side along person in the guided reading group that just introduces the book and says, go ahead, read, and then I'm going to ask you a few questions and maybe prompt you while you, mispronounce a word. The teacher can actually play a much more important role than that to really support bumping up this level of text complexity to be on grade level, regardless of what students' current level of comprehension is. And that is really going to be the key to completing the triangle. So how do we do that? We really want to use the standards. They really challenge us to focus students on meaning making first. We have to focus always first on the text and what the text says. So often we have planned instruction from the standards first. And that is why students struggle to understand text complexity. From now on, teachers need to start planning from the text first. So they need to think about what the meaning of the text is, what makes it complex, and then what needs to be done in service of uncovering that meaning of the text. Text complexity and using text-based evidence are critical to student success in literacy. And so they act like the supports of the latter. Without them, the skills and strategies fall apart. The rest of the standards are on the rungs, and they don't even exist without the text complexity and the evidence, and first and foremost, the deeper level of understanding. So the rungs are the aspects of the text that make it complex. And the standards are the rungs to help students climb the ladder to deeper understanding of meaning. So you first pull away those key ideas and details, just basically what is happening in the text, right? Like what is happening here? And then you're getting slowly up to kind of uncovering what is the author doing to show you, to peel back those layers of meaning, to show you what kind of, idioms are they using, what beautiful language are they using, and how are they using it to get to the deepest level of meaning. So if we really want to teach complex texts, we have to deeply understand the meaning of the text, what makes it complex, and how those two things come together. So for many of our teachers, this is not an intuitive process, right? Many of us were taught to read and find the main idea, rather than tackle the tough sections of the text and deeply analyze the author's craft. As a result, we need to support our teachers to essentially climb the ladder of the standards before the students do, and really give them practice doing that, and give them a systematic way to break down the text and determine how the authors craft those points, what we want students to get out of it, and how the authors craft those points, and then what makes the text complex so they're prepared to support their students to do the same. So at the lesson level, building knowledge requires teachers to center the text and its meaning in the planning process. The ideas of that text drive the lesson. The standards act in service of the text study, not the other way around. So in this approach, we start with the text, and through study of the text itself and what students can gain from it, we practice the skills embedded in the standards. So the big idea here is that we not in the name the steps skills mastery business in the ELA anymore. We're in the business of helping kids make meaning and analyze texts that are actually worth thinking about and that they can learn from. Centering the text allows readers to build vocabulary through context and explicit study. It grows broad knowledge of the world through reading, and it allows for coherence across grades through study of complex texts. Guys, we're not picking a standard and then picking the text to teach that standard anymore. We're picking beautiful, rich, complex text that has really deep meaning that students can grapple with and debate and help grow their love of reading if it's fiction, or really that is going to build their content knowledge of the world, either through science or social studies, in a way that is coherent, meaning we're studying a series of texts about a topic in science or in social studies to build knowledge within that topic over time, right? And when we do that, we can actually study more and more complex texts as students build more knowledge and vocabulary around that topic. These are the kind of texts that we're choosing for kids. And then as we read them and study them ourselves as adults, and we figure out what makes them complex, then those standards are really going to stick out, and they're gonna pop for us, where it's super evident which standards make sense to teach within each text. And it's probably going to be likely that you're going to be teaching more than one standard, probably 2 to 3 standards with one text, as opposed to a standard of the week. You're going to be teaching a text of the week with multiple standards spiraled throughout. So take a minute to pause here and read a little vignette of what a second grade classroom that focuses on nonfiction might look like in a skills-focused classroom versus a knowledge-building classroom. If, for example, this each classroom we're focusing on the text features standard, how does each of these lessons incorporate the standard, and which lesson do you think students would be more engaged in? So the questions are, how does each lesson incorporate the text features standard? And which lesson do you think students would be more engaged in, and why? Go ahead and either turn and talk, put it in the chat, or just come off mute, or raise your hand if you're in person, and start the discussion. Feel free to pause the recording. Great. So just to close the loop here, I want to highlight that in the knowledge building approach, you're still aligning instruction to the standard, but those standards are used in service of deep understanding of the text, right? You are focused on orcas. You're focused on learning about the other types of whales. You're focused on understanding what the pictures and the captions tell us about the orcas, about the whales, and then you're completing a graphic organizer that's helping to hold these facts down so that you can use them later in a research article or whatever writing exercise they're going to be using later. And so they're still talking about text features, but they're not just talking about text features, they're talking about the content of the book. The other thing I would just add is that to a second grader, whales are fun, right? Like, whales are cool, they're huge and big, they're neat animals, they live in the sea, kids love the sea. How many kids do you know that want to be a marine biologist when they're in second grade, right? And that is a cool, fun thing for kids to talk about and explore, and they're going to go home and they're going to tell their parents, Mom, guess what I learned today? I learned about, and they're going to download a whole bunch of facts about orcas and whales, right? And they're going to use the word orca instead of whale, which is so cool. In the other classroom, they're going to go home and talk about that they learned what a caption was, or they're going to think that reading is about captions and pictures, and not about whales and orcas. And what a terrible day that is. What a terrible thing that is, that a kid walks away from an exciting book about whales, that they walk away thinking that they learned about captions. And so that's what we want to flip on its head. So let's look at a more complex text. This is a poem that's pretty complex. It's called The New Colossus by Lazarus. Can I have a volunteer go ahead and come off mute or raise your hand and read this poem for us out loud? You can go ahead and pause the recording. Now, imagine a class of 5th grade students tackling this poem. And if you just focused on teaching them how to find the main idea, right, with questions like, what are the most important details in the text? Or what is the author trying to tell you? Or you just focused on interpreting the structure of the poem. One of my favorite things, what is the rhyme scheme of this poem? Right? Would students be able to unlock this poem's meaning with questions like that? Probably not, right? But this text is in the 4th or 5th grade band for complexity. And students in 5th grade do study U.S. history and potentially immigration. So this could help build useful knowledge. So how could a teacher approach teaching this? Let's take a look. So instead of focusing on one standard, right, instead of just kind of focusing on the standard and choosing that and letting that guide our instruction, we want to think about what students need to get from the text. Really, the central idea here is that America is strong because of its immigrant population, and that the country is really at its best when it rejects some of the traditional power structures, right? It's pretty heavy stuff for 5th graders, but they can get there with some support. And the support needs to come by way of strong questions that really help students engage with the parts of the poem that are difficult. In this case, the structure of the poem is difficult, and the language used to characterize the poem, right? This is really about the Statue of Liberty, the new Colossus, right? And so we use the standards to work in service of those ideas, and we use carefully scaffolded text-specific questions to align to some different standards to get there. So we want kids to recognize that the structure and syntax of the poem is crucial to unpacking its meaning. So there are some questions here that we can ask to help reveal the meaning of the poem. We know that the author contrasts 2 statues, the new Colossus and the Statue of Liberty, and includes additional descriptions of the second statue to reveal its character, right? And so talking about those 2 statues and asking some really specific questions about the first and second statues. And then finally, once we've kind of unpacked the structure and then the character, for quote unquote lack of a better word, of the 2 statues, now we can kind of dig deeper and think about what those say about, like, what the author is trying to use those statues to say in about a critique about America, right? Now, once we figured that out, what standards do these align to? And then we can figure out how to layer on the standards after. So take a minute and put in the chat or turn and talk to a partner. How does it feel to engage with the standards last? How does it feel to layer on the standards after we've worked with the meaning and then the instructional strategy, and then finally layer on the standards? How does that feel? What does that feel like? What are you worried about? What are you excited about? What do we think? Go ahead and pause there and have that discussion. Great. So in the last slide, we talked about thinking about the kind of the deepest level of meaning. What do students really need to get out of there? And then kind of designing these text-dependent questions to get there, and then layering on the standards afterwards. But I want to take a little bit of a step back to think about what are text-dependent and text-specific questions. take a minute to go ahead and pause the recording and read the terms for the indicators for text-dependent, text-specific questions. So the most important thing to understand is that these questions don't require outside knowledge to answer. One misunderstanding that we see so many times with teachers developing questions that require students to think about ideas in the text is that they don't require them to actually have read the text to answer. So for example, in Charlotte's Web, they might say something about, Wilbur and Charlotte are very different, but they are still friends. Can your friends be different from you? These are text-based, right? It's clearly about Charlotte's Web, but they're not text dependent. They don't require you to cite evidence from the text in order to answer that. I can answer that question right now, and I haven't read Charlotte's Web in years, right? And so they have to be, they can only be answered by reading and gathering evidence from the text. And this really promotes rigor and equity because every kid will have been required to have read the text, right? It doesn't require outside content knowledge in order to have read it. And then rigor, because it requires you to find evidence from the text. And that is an element of rigor that should be evident in the standards. Another piece is that it's really important that they focus on the more difficult parts of the text and that they both incorporate the academic vocabulary, so the language used in the text in the question is the language from the text, right? And then it also requires students to use language from the text to answer it. They're also part of specific sections or unique portions or elements of the text. They're not wide and broad sections, right? When they focus on unique portions or elements of the text, this gives an opportunity to scaffold students' understanding of tougher sections of vocabulary and help them kind of unpack the ideas and knowledge that are kind of locked in the text. And you can also use text-dependent and text-specific questions to scaffold student understanding, right, within the task. So they can be literal at first and then move up to analysis, synthesis, and evaluation. What we mean by the last bullet is that you want the best questions are really going to allow students the opportunity to talk about the knowledge that they've gained from the text, or give them an opportunity to share, articulate the impact of the text, right? So, what is the main idea of the text? That's a text-dependent question, but it's so broad that it doesn't give students an opportunity to meaningfully share the knowledge that they've built through reading the text, right? And so the best text-dependent questions are really nuanced and focus on the ideas that students should take away. And it should give them a real opportunity to share what those ideas are. So think about all of these things as you're as you're designing these text-dependent and text-specific questions. And then, just in addition, some other supports that you can use for supporting students in engaging complex text, multiple readings. Complex texts take multiple reads to fully understand the layers of meaning. Now, that doesn't mean you need to reread the entire novel multiple times, but you do need to figure out what parts of the novel are complex or what parts of the passage are complex, and do multiple reads of those parts of the text to really pull out the multiple layers of meaning within that section, right? Or with a poem or a shorter article, doing multiple reads can also assist with fluency, and is really a good way to get students involved with the reading as well. Definitely doing read alouds. We talked about it in K2, but remember that triangle that we talked about a few slides back. You as the teacher can also act as the mediator, right? Even in high school, even in middle school, you can do that first read of a text for kids if it's super complex, so that they're hearing it that first time read by you, and then they can dig in to do a more a much deeper read once you've kind of given them that overview. Chunking text, a longer text, into smaller, more logical sections can make it more manageable, and it can also demonstrate how the author structured the text. So if you can chunk it for a kid the way that an author structured the text, if there's not already headings or something there, or even if there are, this can be sort of a think aloud or something that you're doing for kids to help bring their attention to that structure. We already talked about text-specific questions, but just to reiterate, asking questions that really bring kids' attention to the most complex parts of the text is really going to help. And that last piece is pointing out text structures and text features is going to help provide comprehension support. So things like headers or challenges, like really long paragraphs or sentences, and teaching kids how to break those apart, that's going to be super helpful for them. And it's also a transferable skill. Teaching them how to break apart a really complex, long complex sentence is a skill that can be transferable. Okay, we're going to move into another part, which is about analyzing text complexity, because analyzing text complexity can really be one of the ways that a teacher can help support instruction, right? If a teacher can really understand the meaning, the knowledge demands, the language features, the text features, the text structure of a text and what really makes it complex, then they will be better prepared to help students navigate those specific complexities if they're able to kind of analyze those complexities in the first place. So I want to do a quick overview of how to kind of analyze text quality and complexity, and then show you some of the tools that are available to you. So there's three factors that help us think about text complexity. And the writers of the Common Core state standards, sorry, that's Siri. The founders of the Common Core state standards outlined these three measures of text complexity. And the measures have largely been adopted across the country, regardless of a state's individual stance on the Common Core. So these three measures are quantitative measures. So these look at the factors impacting readability, and most of these are measured by computer programs, right? So these are your Lexile, your readability scales, those kinds of things. The second factor is qualitative measures. So these are looking at levels of meaning, what knowledge demands the text has, any particular language features. So what we were talking about on the last slide with like, are there really long, complex sentences, that kind of stuff. Different text structures, are there flashbacks, things like that. The use of graphics and how supportive they are to the text, how connected they are to the text. And then examining those as measured by an attentive reader. And then the final factor is the reader and the task. So you want to consider any outside factors that might impact the difficulty of reading the text. So the quantitative scale, this is basically just your text, your Common Core band, right, for your text. And so over here, the big ideal here is that there's several tools that exist to measure quantitative values of a text. And the most common is probably the Lexile framework. And there's a really easy website that you can go to either look up books and their Lexile levels, or it also has a Lexile Analyzer. It's Lexile.com, and it has a Lexile Analyzer. So if you have like a passage or a newspaper article or something where you can't just like type it in and look up like you can with a novel or a book, you can type in parts of the text or copy and paste in different parts of the text and check, and it'll analyze the Lexile level for you, which is a super helpful feature of that website. And then it gives you if it spits out a Lexile level here, it'll tell you what Common Core band it's associated with. And like I said, you are generally looking, most states have adopted these levels regardless of whether they've adopted Common Core or not. These scales are pretty normed around the country. One thing to note here, in a K2 classroom, when you're doing read alouds, regardless, you are going to read aloud text in the 2nd to 3rd or 4th to 5th grade bands, because you're reading it aloud. You're taking the demand, a lot of the knowledge, the complexity, you're taking some of that off the kids because you're doing read aloud. And so you want to choose text in a higher complexity band. So just a note there, that's really super important. As we said, quantitative measures alone are not sufficient. you would be probably shocked to know that the Grapes of Wrath has a Lexile in the 2nd to 3rd grade placement band. But I think we can all probably safely agree that the Jodes are not appropriate. Our 2nd and 3rd graders are probably not ready to take on the Jodes. John Steinbeck writes in a very, simplistic, he uses simple language and dialogue, but that's a stylistic choice because he's using it to support the the times that were very, simplistic, supposedly simplistic times. But that makes the text very readable, right? You can read the words in the text, but that doesn't mean that the themes and the allusions in the text are not incredibly complex and deep. This is a text that is much more, appropriate with its, allusions to Christianity, its themes of humanity, and what it means, its knowledge demands about the Depression. Those are much more appropriate for high school. So what makes a text complex? Like we talked about, you're going to look at meaning, structure, language demands, knowledge. So what content knowledge is needed? There could be disciplinary knowledge if you're studying a science text. Intertextuality, which is, does it reference other texts or other movies or, cultural references, that kind of stuff. The language demands include vocabulary, figurative language, sentence length and structure. We talked about that before. Just the layers of meaning, the concept complexity, what is the theme, and is it accessible to younger readers? Like, do they know about it? And then, so is the theme accessible? And then how easy is it to determine it? Those kinds of things. And then text features, how is it organized? Structure. How is it organized? How is the piece organized? What genre is it? Is it familiar, unfamiliar? Has it been studied before? All of those pieces are really important. So, good news is that Student Achievement Partners has come up with a rubric, basically, to help us evaluate the qualitative features of text complexity. And so there is a literature one, and there's one for informational texts, and you can use these to help make the intangible a little bit more tangible for you. And so the link to these is in the resources that come with the this presentation. And so these are super helpful for analyzing the qualitative features of a text. The key here is to not analyze the text as a whole, but to actually pick one of the more complex parts of the text and analyze that, right? So actually go in and say, hey, these are the 2 to 3 more complex parts of the text, I'm going to analyze these 3 parts with the rubric. And that's what you should use to do the analysis. So the last piece here you're going to be looking at are the reader and the task variables. With the reader, you're going to be thinking about their motivation, their knowledge, and the experience that they're all coming in with. So if we go back to that whale, orca example that we were thinking about in the 2nd grade classroom, if you have several kids, if you're teaching a class with several kids who are struggling readers, and you're teaching a complex grade level text on whales and orcas, and you've already taught, several, you've already been, learning about whales, you've been learning about sea life, and this is, several texts into a unit, and your kids are loving it, right? They're learning a lot of vocabulary, they have some background knowledge, and they're really excited to read this new text. Your kids are going to have more access to this text than they would another random text about the Civil War or the Revolutionary War, a text at the same level of complexity, a text that is at the same grade level. They're going to be able to access this text about whales at a much higher level. It's going to be much easier for them to access. You also have to think about the tasks, because the purpose, why are they reading it, the complexity of the task, and the complexity of the questions are all going to matter. All right. The last thing we want to make sure you guys do is reflect and determine any action steps you have to apply to your current work. Great. So for those of you who have been with us for the last 5 weeks, I want you to think about how all of these essential best practices in reading instruction work together. So thinking about way back to our foundational skills instruction, to our knowledge building and vocabulary session, to today's session on navigating complex texts. I want you to think about how all of those things work together to really help students learn to read. Go ahead and pause and have a discussion, or go ahead and write in the chat your answer to that question. If you haven't been with us for the last 5 weeks, and this is a standalone session, or if you have been with us for the last 5 weeks and you finished your last reflection, I want you to go ahead and think about how you're going to put this session into practice. So what are your aha moments or surprises that you experience as a result of this session? What is at least one key learning that you will apply to your work? And then what wonderings do you still have about engaging students in complex texts? Go ahead and write those down, whether that's in the chat box or on a sticky note or in a notebook, and then share them with someone next to you if you're in person, or in the chat box if you're not.
If your school or district is interested in direct support related to the content of this session, or if you have any questions, please contact TNTP by emailing maya.baker@tntp.org or christopher.henderson@tntp.org. You can also visit us online at tntp.org or find us on Facebook, Twitter, or LinkedIn.